I'm at the end of my second phase of my life, and you're at pretty much the beginning of your second phase of life. I think that basically life exists in three phases. You start off, phase one is you're dependent on others and you're learning. Phase two is that you're working and others become dependent on you and you're trying to be successful. And then you get later in stage two, and the number one goal that you want more than anything else is to help people be successful without you. Then you can go to stage three, which is, you're sort of free of obligations and so on. And what I did over a period of time, whenever I would encounter a situation and make decisions, I would write down the criteria for making decisions. So my number one objective is to tell you that you need to have your own principles. I'll explain some things, but I'm going to share some of my principles. I hope they're helpful to you. There are things that have worked for me that I've written down over a period of time. But number one, I want to describe this experience to you. Whenever you're in a situation, and if you take the time after that situation and you write down your criteria for making decisions, then you will have that for the next time that thing comes along. And what happens is the same things happen over and over again for the same kind of reasons, but you don't see that. You're operating in a way where you take them one at a time. And so I would recommend to you that you write those principles down. When you do that, you think about them in a deeper way, and then the people that are in your lives then start to understand how you're behaving, and they can be partners in that idea meritocratic decision making, so that they can also say, is that the best way to operate and deal with that situation? And so you start to think in a more principled way rather than all of these bits and pieces of different things. So that would be my recommendation. But what I'm going to do is take you through a little bit of my journey, and it's totally correct, as Peter says. I'm really a very ordinary guy who, through trial and error, discovered some things that worked that helped me do what Peter was describing. So what I want to explain is, like, we look at the world, and there are just so many different things to have principles for. Principles are essentially recipes for dealing with situations that happen over and over again. And there's just a million things. You could study, you could be a doctor, you could be a physicist, you could be someone. And the things that I understand and spend time with was economics, investments, and then work. And my approach was largely captured in this slide, which is to say, like, I would go after audacious goals, and then I would succeed and fail, and most importantly, benefited from failure. In other words, you go after your goals, and you then encounter your problems or your failures. And how you're dealing with those problems is one of the most important things. I started to realize, for reasons you'll probably see as we go along, that pain plus reflection equals progress. In other words, that painful situation, if you can diagnose what produced that failure and then develop principles for dealing with it at a different time, in a different way, and then you take those principles and you improve, you learn, you change things, then you improve and you make go on to more audacious goals. And the way I look at life is pretty much like it's this looping process, this evolutionary looping process. That means you go after your audacious goals, you fail, you learn. Failure is an important part of that process. You learn principles, you keep improving. And so I think that I learned that there are only 5 things that you need to do to be successful. If you do these 5 things, you will be successful. And the first is to be clear on what your goals are. You have to know what you're going after. You can't have everything in the world, but you could have almost anything you want, but you can't have everything you want. If you go after your goals and they're clear, you have to know your goals. And along the way, number 2 is you have to identify and not tolerate your problems. A lot of people tolerate problems. And then you have to diagnose those problems to get at the root cause of those problems. And often the root cause is you. Maybe you have weaknesses. Maybe you make mistakes. And with that, or maybe somebody else is making mistakes. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And the power of being able to know our strengths and weaknesses and know how to deal with them is enormous. And only when you know what your problems are and you diagnose that specifically, can you create a design to get around those problems. And that design, very specific design, you go get around the problems, and then if you have a design, you have to be reliable in doing that. And everybody is bad at some of these steps. And the key is to work with other people who are good where you're weak. So I just want to give you a sense of failure. I think probably the greatest problem of mankind, it's a big statement, biggest problem of mankind, the greatest tragedy of mankind is individuals who have in their minds wrong opinions that they're attached to. And they could so easily stress test those to put them out there and find out if they're strong or weak in terms of those opinions, and to move beyond that to make better decisions. And it's a tragedy because it could be so easily dealt with. You can reduce the chances of being wrong by properly stress testing them. And I want to take you through an experience just briefly of what happened to me that changed my whole approach to decision making. This was in 1980, 81, and I had analyzed that American banks had lent a lot more money to emerging countries than those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that we were going to have a debt crisis, a big debt crisis. And I thought that that would have a very bad effect on the economy. I couldn't have been more wrong. That was the exact bottom in the stock market. And we had this decade of success, and it was extremely painful. I lost money for me, I lost money for clients. I lost so much money that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to pay for my family bills. I had to let people go. It was really terrible, but it turned out to be probably one of the best things that happened in my life because it changed my approach to decision making. You like it or not, radical transparency and algorithmic decision making is coming at you fast, and it's going to change your life. That's because it's now easy to take algorithms and embed them into computers and gather all that data that you're leaving on yourself all over the place, and know what you're like, and then direct the computers to interact with you in ways that are better than most people can. While that might sound scary, I've been doing this for a long time, and I have found it to be wonderful. My objective has been to have meaningful work and meaningful relationships with the people I work with, and I've learned that I couldn't have that unless I had that radical transparency and that algorithmic decision making. I want to show you why that is. I want to show you how it works, and I warn you that some of the things that I'm going to show you probably are a little bit shocking. Since I was a kid, I've had a terrible rote memory, and I didn't like following instructions. I was no good at following instructions, but I loved to figure out how things work for myself. When I was 12, I hated school, but I fell in love with trading the markets. I caddied at the time, earned about $5 a bag, and I took my caddying money and I put it in the stock market. And that was just because the stock market was hot at the time. And the first company I bought was a company by the name of Northeast Airlines. Northeast Airlines was the only company I heard of that was selling for less than $5 a share. And I figured I could buy more shares, and if it went up, I'd make more money. So that was a dumb strategy, right? But I tripled my money. I tripled my money because I got lucky. The company was about to go bankrupt, but some other company acquired it, and I tripled my money. And I was hooked. And I thought, this game is easy. With time, I learned this game is anything but easy. In order to be an effective investor, one has to bet against the consensus and be right. And it's not easy to bet against the consensus and be right. One has to bet against the consensus and be right because the consensus is built into the price. And in order to be an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur, one has to bet against the consensus and be right. I had to be an entrepreneur and an investor. And what goes along with that is making a lot of painful mistakes. So I made a lot of painful mistakes. And with time, my attitude about those mistakes began to change. I began to think of them as puzzles, that if I could solve the puzzles, they would give me gems. And the puzzles were, what would I do differently in the future so I wouldn't make that painful mistake? And the gems were principles that I would then write down so I would remember them, that would help me in the future. And because I wrote them down so clearly, I could then eventually discovered I could then embed them into algorithms.